What if I told you that the ancient stories in Genesis, they weren't actually written as like magical fairy tales
Right.
or, these polished Sunday school morality lessons, but instead they were written as a brutal, blood-soaked survival manual for the ancient world?
Yeah, that's exactly what they are.
Welcome to this deep dive. I am incredibly glad you are here with us today listening to this.
Yeah.
We're taking massive departure from how you might typically hear these texts
It's
discussed.
huge departure.
Yeah. Today is installment 7 of our series on the materialist Christianity algorithm, and we have a very intense, very specific mission for you today.
We really do.
We are going to run a complete forensic sociological teardown of Genesis chapters 16, 17, 18, and 19. Basically, we are stepping into the mud.
We are indeed stepping into the mud. And to do this properly, to really see what these sources are actually doing,
Yeah.
we have to completely change the lens through which we view this ancient world.
Right.
We are going to treat religion, specifically in this historical context, as applied physics.
Applied physics.
Okay.
Okay, I want to stop you right there because that is a massive paradigm shift.
It is, yeah.
What does it actually mean to read Genesis as, applied physics? Like, if I'm listening to this on my commute right now, how should I be picturing this?
Well, it means we start with one foundational assumption, right? The ancient writers were not hallucinating magic.
Okay.
They were not just sitting in their tents making up mythological bedtime stories about lightning bolts and angels just to entertain themselves.
Like ancient sci-fi or something.
Exactly. It wasn't fiction. They were documenting the brutal, undeniable physical realities of human survival. They were mapping out tribal law, natural law, and like this intense social friction.
So they were essentially writing code for civilization.
Exactly. That's a great way to put it. Every spiritual, miraculous, or divine word you read in this text, it is actually a container.
A container.
Yeah, think of it as a conceptual bucket holding a very real, material, sociological, or even psychological truth.
Okay, I'm tracking.
So when you encounter spiritual language in these sources, words like spirit, glory, blessing, curse, or miracle, we are not going to translate those mechanically.
Right.
We are going to reverse engineer them. We have to ask, what specific physical friction or social crisis was this community facing at that exact moment?
Wow, okay.
And what structural utility did this specific concept provide to keep these people from just, tearing each other apart?
So when the text says something like, God bless them or God curse the ground, we aren't looking at, like, a wizard waving a wand from the clouds.
No, not at all.
We're looking at a civilization trying to articulate a massive shift in their crop yields, or maybe a total breakdown in their social order.
Precisely.
And they are using the vocabulary of the divine to enforce the gravity of that material reality.
Precisely. And that brings us to the methodology we'll be strictly adhering to for this deep dive.
Okay, lay it out for us.
Our protocol has 3 distinct steps. We just covered the first one, which is reverse engineering the vocabulary. The second step is what we call getting down to the rebar.
The rebar. I love this part.
Yeah, the morphological grounding.
This is the part that, for me, completely changes the game.
Because we are not going to, float around in vague philosophical summaries today.
No.
For every single text block we look at, we are going to locate, extract, and physically translate the ancient Hebrew roots.
Right, getting our hands dirty.
Exactly. We are going to strip away the polished, spiritualized English translations you might be used to, and we'll expose the raw, physical, agricultural dirt of the original language.
The rebar that holds the concrete together.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because if we don't show you the physical dirt and the actual mechanics of the original language, we fail the structural audit. We simply cannot tell you what the text means without first showing you how it was physically built.
Okay. And then comes the third step, which is where this goes from being like a cool history lesson to a mind-bending architectural map.
Right.
The dialectical trajectory.
The dialectical trajectory. We are going to draw a direct, continuous, and highly logical line from the specific ancient survival mechanism we uncover in the Old Testament text, straight to the exact moment in the New Testament, where Christ directly confronts, absorbs, or utilizes that exact same mechanism.
And we are not going to shoehorn in some, generic feel-good summary of the gospel either.
Definitely not.
If the connection doesn't emerge organically from the specific text we are analyzing, like if we cannot find the exact dialectical link to tie off the wire we just ran, then the translation fails.
That's high wire act.
It really is. But before we jump into the text of Genesis 16, I feel like we need to establish the baseline context.
Yes, context is everything here.
Right. So put yourself in the shoes of the people actually living this reality. What is the geopolitical and, well, economic reality of this world?
So, if we look at the historical materialist context of this era, we are observing a society operating under what we can call primitive class morality.
Primitive class morality.
Okay. Yeah. This is an era where early classless tribal structures are painfully, and I mean painfully, transitioning into herder kingdom societies.
Right.
And you have to understand the primary driver of this entire system. It is extreme, unrelenting scarcity.
Scarcity, meaning like there isn't enough water,
None.
there isn't enough food, there isn't enough security. If it doesn't rain, your entire family just dies.
That is the literal reality. And when society transitions from small nomadic family groups to larger, more centralized tribal states, under those brutal conditions of starvation and exposure, you see intense internal conflict.
Of course, people panic.
Exactly. You have hunger-related crises, violently contested property disputes, and brutal leadership struggles. In this environment, morality is not about universal ethics.
Right, it's not about philosophy.
It's not about abstract philosophy. It's not about being a good person in the modern Western sense. Morality is defined purely in terms of survival, obedience, loyalty to kin, and ritual purity.
Because if you aren't loyal, the tribe fractures.
Exactly.
And if the tribe fractures, everyone starves or gets wiped out by the tribe over the next hill who didn't fracture.
That's the math. Property, patriarchy, and bloodlines dominate the entire moral field because those are the only tangible mechanisms that guarantee biological continuity.
Okay, so to understand this society, we have to look at its absolute foundational economic engine. And in an ancient agrarian tribal society facing constant existential threat, that engine isn't money.
No, it's not coin.
It's reproduction. It's human property, which brings us directly and frankly quite uncomfortably into Genesis 16.
It does. Genesis 16 is a masterclass in the economics of reproduction and the structural visibility of the underclass.
Okay, let me set the narrative anchor for you, the listener, so we have the plot straight before we completely tear it down.
Go for it.
We have Sarai, who is Abram's wife. She is unable to conceive. Now, in this society, that's not just a personal tragedy, right? It's a total failure of the economic and structural imperative.
A total systemic failure.
Right. So Sarai takes her Egyptian slave,
Right.
Hagar, and gives her to Abram to produce an heir. Hagar conceives, and immediately, massive social tension erupts between the two women.
Right.
It gets so bad that Hagar flees into the brutal, unforgiving wilderness. That's the story we all know. But let's run the materialist teardown on this. Let's look at the agrarian patriarchy. What is actually happening here beneath the surface?
What's fascinating here is the sheer brutality of the power dynamics when you strip away that Sunday school veneer.
Yeah.
We have to understand that in this era, women are literal property.
Literal property.
Yes, they are managed for labor and for inheritance. The historical sources are very clear on this. Practices like polygyny and surrogacy in these texts, they are absolutely not divine endorsements of virtue.
Right. I think a lot of modern readers get really tripped up by this. They think God is sitting up there saying, you know, it's a great moral system. Having multiple wives and using slaves as breeding stock?
Not at all. These practices are structural necessities for an agrarian patriarchy that is desperately trying to manage labor, ensure lineage, and maintain male dominance under conditions of constant tribal warfare.
It's pure survival logistics.
The purpose of this arrangement was survival and reproduction, period. Women were not equal subjects in this covenant. They were biological assets.
Okay, let's unpack this using a corporate analogy because honestly, this is the only way my modern brain can process it without just screaming at the injustice of it all.
Let's hear it.
Imagine you are looking at Abram and Sarai's household as a modern corporation. Let's call them Tribe Inc.
Tribe Inc. Okay.
The parent company is facing an existential crisis. They have no succession plan. The board of directors, the tribal elders, they're going to panic, the stock is going to plummet, and a hostile takeover from a neighboring tribe is imminent because weakness is visible.
Right. The vulnerability is obvious to everyone.
So the CEO, Sarai, makes a cold, calculated business decision. She decides to liquidate the assets of a wholly owned subsidiary, Hagar's womb, to keep the parent company solvent.
That is a chilling but entirely accurate materialist reading of the situation.
It's dark.
It is dark. Hagar is not viewed as a human being with individual agency here. She is a biological asset being leveraged to produce a necessary commodity, which is a male heir.
But wait, I have to play devil's advocate here for a second.
Yeah.
Wasn't this just standard operating procedure in the ancient Near East? Like, why is the text focusing on it so much?
It was standard procedure, yes. But the text focuses on it because the system breaks down.
Ugh.
The subsidiary asset pushes back. Hagar conceives, and she realizes she now holds the sole commodity keeping the entire company afloat.
Oh, wow.
The text says she looks at Sarai with contempt, the power dynamic suddenly inverts, and Sarai retaliates with systemic abuse, effectively driving Hagar out into the desert.
And this is where we have to reframe Hagar's flight, don't we?
Huh.
Like, if you are reading this as just a domestic dispute between two jealous women, you are missing the entire architectural scale of the text.
Absolutely. That is a massive trivialization of what's happening. Materially, Hagar's flight into the wilderness is a class rebellion.
Class rebel.
It is a literal labor strike. And it is a strike that threatens the absolute biological survival of the ruling family.
Right, because she has the heir.
Exactly. By taking the unborn heir into the desert, she isn't just running away. She is walking away with the entire future of Tribe Inc. She's bankrupting the parent company.
Okay, so she's out in the wilderness. She's by a spring of water. And this is where we need to get down to the linguistic dirt. Let's do the morphological grounding. Take us into the raw Hebrew. What is happening in this moment of total isolation?
Let's extract the structural anchors from the ancient manuscript. We're looking at Genesis 16, verse 13.
Okay.
Hagar encounters a divine messenger in the desert, and she gives God a name. In English, it's usually translated nicely as, "You are the God who sees me."
Right, a very common phrase.
But let's look at the source root. We are isolating the Hebrew word roi, R-O-I. It
Right.
comes from the phrase El Roi.
El
Exactly, which literally translates to God of seeing.
Roy. Seeing. Okay, so if we apply our protocol, right, if we assume religion is applied physics, we are not looking at a magic sky father suddenly turning a telescope toward the desert to check on her.
No, we have to strip away the spiritualized English.
So what is the material sociological utility of seeing in this exact moment? Why does Roy matter so much here?
Materially, seeing here is the sociopolitical recognition of personhood.
Okay, unpack that.
You have to remember Hagar's exact status. In the Hebrew, she is a shifcha.
A shifsha.
Yes, that is a very specific class of female slave whose sole function is as a biological and labor asset. She is, by definition, structurally invisible.
Structurally invisible.
Right? She does not have a face in society. She only has a function. So when Hagar names the divine El Roi, the god of seeing what is happening materially, divine sight in this text is the sudden, radical bestowing of subjecthood on the completely invisible underclass.
Oh, wow. Bestowing a subjecthood. She goes from being a what to a who. She realizes, out there in the desert, completely stripped of the tribal hierarchy, that she actually exists. She has a face. Her pain is actually recognized.
Yes.
But, okay, here is my pushback. If Hagar suddenly gains visibility or personhood in the wilderness, how on earth does the rigid tribal structure handle that?
That's the friction.
Right. How does Tribe Inc. deal with a subsidiary asset that suddenly realizes it has human rights? Because the text doesn't let her stay in the desert. It says she is told to go back and submit to Sarai. That feels to me like a massive step backwards.
It feels like a step backwards to modern sensibilities, absolutely. But it raises the core tension of the entire narrative. The primitive tribal structure cannot handle her personhood.
It just can't compute it.
The system is simply not designed to accommodate the humanity of a shifsha. It literally requires her invisibility to function. So the narrative has her return, carrying this radical new consciousness, this divine sight, back into the oppressive structure.
Like a virus in the code.
Exactly. The tension is palpable. The structure is cracked, but it hasn't broken yet. The text is documenting the very first fissures in the foundation of class-based human property.
She walks back into the tent, knowing she is a human being, even if they still treat her like a machine.
Yes.
And this is where we map the dialectical trajectory. We have to draw the wire from this exact material mechanism, the divine Roy, the sociopolitical visibility of the discarded female underclass, straight to the New Testament.
We do.
Slow this down for us. Show us the math. How does this connect to Christ?
The wire connects directly with absolute precision to the Gospels. Think about the society Christ enters in the first century.
Okay.
It is still fundamentally an agrarian patriarchy. Women, especially those without male protectors or those deemed ritually unclean, are still treated as invisible biological property or discarded assets.
Okay, think about the listener right now. If you've read the Gospels, you know these characters. Think about the bleeding woman in Mark chapter 5. She's been bleeding for 12 years. She is utterly invisible, completely discarded by society, ritually bankrupt.
Exactly. Or consider the Samaritan woman at the well in John chapter 4.
Oh, yeah.
A woman with a complex marital history, fetching water in the heat of the day to avoid the rest of the town.
No.
What does Christ do in these moments? He doesn't just quietly heal them and move on.
No, he doesn't.
He physically halts entire crowds. He stops the forward momentum of the social machine to do one specific thing.
To see them.
Yes,
That-
to see them.
Oh, man. He absorbs the patriarchal discard mechanism.
He does. He takes that divine sight, the exact Roy that Hagar discovered in the total isolation of the wilderness, and he weaponizes it right in the center of first century society.
He drags the Roy out of the desert and drops it into the town square. He stops everything and says, look at her.
By stopping the crowd to recognize the bleeding woman, by speaking publicly and at length to the Samaritan woman, he is granting full, undeniable subjecthood to the marginalized underclass in front of the very power structures that demand their invisibility. The dialectical trajectory is perfectly unbroken. From the invisible slave in Genesis realizing she is seen, to Christ forcing the entire society to see the invisible.
That is just incredible. The math works perfectly.
It really does.
But, you know, if we go back to Genesis, Hagar's rebellion, her labor strike, it exposed a terrifying vulnerability in Abram's household. Think about it.
Yeah.
If you are trying to survive in a desert and your property, your laborers, and your actual biological heirs can just decide they have personhood and walk away into the wilderness.
The tribe is in constant danger of dissolving.
Likely.
If we connect this to the bigger picture of survival, a tribe in this era simply cannot survive that kind of internal fragmentation. If people can just leave when they are unhappy, you don't have a tribe. You have a waiting room for starvation.
Right. So the tribe needs a structural, permanent boundary marker. They need something that enforces loyalty in a way that you can't just walk away from. You need a ledger that cannot be erased.
A permanent ledger.
And that brings us to the next critical phase, Genesis 17, and the architecture of the covenant, namely circumcision.
Genesis 17 is where the text builds the physical walls of the society.
Okay, lay it out.
The narrative anchor is clear. God changes Abram's name to Abraham, signifying a new structural reality, and mandates the covenant of circumcision for every single male in the household.
Right.
Now, importantly, this isn't just for biological family members. It explicitly includes purchased slaves. Everyone within the economic unit must bear the mark.
Okay, let's get down to the rebar. Let's do the morphological grounding here. What are the specific Hebrew roots we are extracting?
We need to isolate two primary anchors from the source text. First, the concept of the covenant itself. In Genesis 17, we find the word berit.
Berit, B-E-R-I-T.
Yes. Second, we have to look at the actual physical mechanics of the act. We isolate the root yimel, which means to be circumcised, and the word orla, which translates to foreskin.
Berit, Yimel, and Orla. Okay, let's do the materialist teardown, the physical ledger. Because normally you hear the word covenant and you think of a nice promise.
It's like a spiritual handshake.
Right, like a rainbow or a sweet promise with God. I'll be your God, you be my people. But materially, that's not what a berit is it?
Not even close. A berit is not a magical promise or a warm spiritual feeling. It is an ironclad, material treaty.
An ironclad treaty.
Think about the environment we established at the beginning. Extreme scarcity, shifting nomadic borders, constant threat of starvation or slaughter. In a landscape like that, you cannot rely on verbal loyalty. Words are wind.
Right.
If a rival tribe across the valley offers your slaves or your sons a better deal or more water, they will simply pack up their tents and leave.
Right, just like Hagar tried to do. She just walked away.
Exactly. So to prevent the tribe from fracturing, you require an undeniable, permanent, and physically intimate marker of allegiance. The beret is a survival mechanism. By mandating circumcision, the patriarch and the purchased slave are suddenly bound under one biological and legal umbrella.
I love this. It's like, okay, think about how modern technology tries to solve the problem of trust.
Okay.
Circumcision in Genesis 17 is essentially an irrevocable smart contract executed on a biological blockchain.
That is a brilliant analogy. It tracks perfectly with the sociology of the era.
Right. Think about it. It's incredibly painful to execute, which proves your absolute commitment to the group. It is impossible to fake, and once it's done, you are permanently written onto the tribe's ledger.
You can't erase it?
You cannot undo it and pretend you belong to the uncircumcised tribe across the river. It enforces the boundary. But I have a major pushback here.
Go ahead.
If they just needed a permanent mark to prevent defection, why target the reproductive organ specifically? Why not a facial tattoo? Why not brand their hand or their shoulder like you would with cattle? Why the orla?
Because of what we just discussed in Genesis 16, what is the central economic engine of this society?
Reproduction.
It is reproduction and bloodlines. You don't brand the hand because labor is actually secondary. You brand the reproductive organ because you are claiming ownership over the future.
Wow. Owning the future.
Yes. It ensures that the reproductive capabilities of the entire household sons and slaves alike are branded by tribal law. It prevents internal fragmentation by dictating exactly who belongs to the lineage and who has rights to the inheritance. And the text is utterly ruthless about the enforcement. It explicitly states that if you do not carry the mark, you are cut off from the people.
Cut off. Let's unpack that, because that sounds like a religious excommunication. Like, you can't come to church anymore.
Yeah.
But materially, what does that mean?
Materially, being cut off means exile from the economic and survival network. It means you are pushed outside the camp.
And outside the camp is the death.
And outside the camp is death by exposure or starvation.
So it's an involuntary, violently exclusionary system. You are either in the in-group, marked in your own blood, or you are in the out-group, left to die. There is no middle ground.
None.
So how does this dialectical trajectory map to the New Testament? Run the wire for us. Where does this exact mechanism of blood inclusion show up?
The physical marking of a reproductive organ successfully controlled lineage and inheritance. But as you said, it created an involuntary, exclusionary in-group versus out-group crisis.
Yeah.
It was a boundary defined by blood specifically, the shedding of a tribal member's own blood to prove belonging. The direct, specific New Testament connection to this exact mechanism of a blood-based burial is the Last Supper.
Okay, walk me through this. Slow it down.
Christ sits down with his followers and directly confronts this exact mechanism of tribal inclusion. He takes the cup and explicitly redefines the beret.
The covenant.
Yes, he says, this cup is the new covenant, the new beret in my blood. The dialectical shift here is absolute. It is a mathematical inversion of the Genesis 17 algorithm.
Let me see if I follow the math here. In Genesis 17, the brit requires the involuntary, exclusionary shedding of a tribal member's blood, the circumcision to gain access to the group. You bleed to get in.
Yes. And at the Last Supper, we shift to the voluntary, inclusive shedding of Christ's own blood, which binds a universal post-tribal collective.
Oh my God. He takes the exclusionary boundary marker and absorbs the blood cost himself.
Exactly. He blows the boundary wide open so that inclusion is no longer based on biological branding or tribal lineage. It's based on participation in his voluntarily given life. It resolves the crisis of the outgroup without destroying the concept of the covenant itself.
That is just, it's a structural masterpiece.
Yeah.
The algorithm completely flips the polarity of the blood covenant.
It flips it completely.
It takes the very thing that kept people out, the very thing that demanded violent tribal loyalty, and turns it into the mechanism that brings everyone in.
It is the perfect dialectical resolution.
Okay, so chapter 17 secures the internal boundary of the tribe in blood. The walls of the society are built. The ledger is secure. But once you have walls, you have a new problem.
You do.
You have to figure out how to deal with the people outside the walls. The text immediately forces Abraham to define how his newly solidified tribe interacts with the external world. And that brings us to Genesis 18 and what you were calling the calculus of civic justice.
This is one of the most fascinating chapters in the entire text because it begins with a quiet domestic scene that rapidly, almost violently, escalates into a massive geopolitical negotiation.
Let's set the narrative anchor. Visitors arrive at Abraham's tent. They tell Abraham that Sarah is going to have a son within a year. Sarah, who is elderly, is listening at the tent door, and she laughs at the sheer biological impossibility of it.
Right.
But then, the scene shifts drastically. The visitors look down toward the doomed city of Sodom, and Abraham steps forward to bargain with God. He asks, will the judge of all the earth really sweep away the righteous with the wicked?
We need the morphological grounding for both parts of this narrative. First, let's look at Sarah's laugh. The Hebrew root here is sachak.
Sachak.
Yes, that laugh is structurally vital. And for Abraham's negotiation, we extract the core anchors from verses 19 and 25. We have the word tzedakah, which translates to righteousness. We have mishpat, which translates to justice. And we have sadiq, which means the righteous person.
Sachak, Sedaka, Mishpat, and Tzedek. Let's do the materialist teardown. You call this the structural threshold. Let's start with Sarah's laugh. The Sachak. Why does a woman laughing in a tent matter structurally to the physics of this text?
Because from a materialist lens, Sarah's laugh is the sound of friction.
Friction.
It is the friction of material reality, the undeniable physical failure of an elderly body colliding with a structural divine command. The structure of the text says this lineage must reproduce to survive. The material reality of her biology says that is impossible. Her laugh is the human recognition of that absurdity. But the narrative pushes through that friction to establish the lineage anyway, proving that the structural imperative of the text will override biological limits.
The survival of the tribe overrides the biology.
Exactly.
And once that internal future is secured, despite the friction, Abraham turns his attention to the external world. He looks down at Sodom, and he starts bargaining. What if there are 50 righteous people in the city? 45, 30, 20, 10.
Right.
Now, typically, if you grew up hearing this, it is preached as a story of ethereal piety. Abraham, the great intercessor, begging for mercy for his neighbors. But we are looking at this as applied physics.
Exactly. This is not ethereal piety. Abraham is applying a rigid mathematical calculus to civic justice. We have to understand those two linguistic roots, tzedakah and mishpat.
Righteousness and justice.
Yes, but in this ancient context, these are not abstract moral feelings. They aren't about having a pure heart. They are the functional civic order required to keep a city from collapsing in on itself.
Okay, unpack that.
Tzedakah is right relationship, fair dealing, economic equity. Mishpat is the legal execution of that fairness. Together, they are the social infrastructure.
I'm going to use an analogy here because civic justice can sound a bit dry.
Go ahead.
Think of Abraham's negotiation like an infrastructure stress test on a massive bridge. Imagine you are looking at the city of Sodom, which is a bridge, and you can see the concrete is spalling, the rebar is rusting, the suspension cables are snapping one by one, the civic order is collapsing.
Yes, perfect.
And Abraham goes to the chief engineer and says, okay, look, I know this bridge is failing, but if this bridge has 50 solid load-bearing pillars among 100 rotting ones, will it hold the weight of the traffic? Can the structure hold?
That is exactly the calculus. Abraham is trying to determine the baseline threshold for societal survival. He is asking the cosmos how many functional cooperative nodes, the Sadikim, the righteous people, are required to keep a corrupt system from catastrophic failure.
Wow.
If there are 50 Sadikim, does their tzedakah, their right dealing, generate enough social cohesion to offset the decay of the rest of the city? What if there are only 45? At what point does the bridge collapse?
He haggles it all the way down to 10. But I have to ask you, isn't Abraham essentially unionizing the righteous minority to leverage the CEO of the universe? He's haggling over the liquidation value of a toxic asset. He's saying, look, Sodom's a terrible investment, but if I can find 10 performing assets inside it, you can't liquidate the whole portfolio.
He is absolutely trying to leverage the performing assets to save the portfolio, but he is doing something even more foundational. He is defining the character of the judge.
How so?
He is establishing the rule that legitimate authority cannot arbitrarily destroy the functional nodes along with the dysfunctional ones. The math has to make sense. The universe must operate on a rational calculus of justice, not just raw, destructive, tyrannical power.
So if that is the Old Testament algorithm, finding the minimum number of righteous nodes to prevent a city from collapsing, how do we map this mathematical calculus of justice to the New Testament? Trace the wire for us.
We trace it straight to Golgotha, the crucifixion. Think about how Abraham's negotiation ends in Genesis. He bargains the threshold down to 10 righteous men, but the math ultimately fails. Sodom does not have the critical mass of Sadikim to hold the structure together. The city is mathematically doomed to collapse.
It doesn't even have 10 load-bearing pillars. The bridge is coming down.
Right. Now fast forward to the New Testament. Christ becomes the dialectical conclusion of this exact calculus. By the time he's on the cross, the civic and religious structures of Jerusalem and Rome have completely failed.
They're broken.
Their mishpat, their justice, is executing an innocent man. The structure is entirely corrupt. Christ is the single remaining tzaddik. He is the one righteous node left in the system.
And he's hanging on the cross.
And here's the inversion. Instead of bargaining to save the city based on its remaining goodness, which is what Abraham did, looking for 50, then 10, Christ intercedes for the city based on its total, absolute failure. From the cross, he looks at the society executing him and says, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do."
Wow. So the required threshold of righteous citizens drops to 0.
Exactly. The math at Genesis 18 reaches its terminal point. The required threshold drops to 0, and the single Sadic, Christ, absorbs the structural collapse of the entire system into his own body.
That is just profound.
He doesn't bargain for the city's preservation by pointing to its virtues. He secures its future by absorbing the consequences of its complete lack of tzedakah and mishpat.
That is heavy. The single Sadic absorbing the collapse so the city doesn't have to burn. But if we go back to Genesis, Abraham's math failed because Sodom didn't even have 10. The city was already in terminal decline.
It was.
Which brings us down the mountain, away from the theoretical negotiation, and directly into the violent, terrifying streets of the city itself, Genesis 19, and the physics of societal collapse.
This is where we witness what terminal societal decline actually looks like on the ground.
Let's set the narrative anchor. 2 visitors, the messengers we saw earlier, arrive in Sodom. Lot, Abraham's nephew, takes them in. But the men of the city, a literal mob, surround Lot's house.
Yeah.
They demand that Lot bring the visitors out so they can sexually assault them. It's a horrific, chaotic scene. Lot, in a desperate and frankly repulsive attempt to protect his guests, offers the mob his own daughters instead. This is a brutal return to the patriarchal property dynamics we saw with Hagar in chapter 16. Women as disposable assets. The mob refuses the daughters, they try to break down the door, and then the catastrophe hits. The messengers blind the mob, and fire and brimstone rain down on the city. As they flee, Lot's wife looks back and becomes a pillar of salt.
To understand this through our protocol, we need the rebar. Let's isolate the tools of destruction from the text. In the Hebrew, we extract the word gofrit, which translates to brimstone or sulfur.
Oh, freight.
And we extract esh, which is fire. Furthermore, we isolate the consequence for Lot's wife, melach, meaning salt.
Gofrit, esh, and melach. Brimstone, fire, and salt. So let's run the materialist teardown on this mob and this destruction. What is the actual terminal friction happening here? Why does this specific sin trigger the apocalypse?
We have to deconstruct the mob. For centuries, the sin of Sodom has been spiritualized or narrowed down almost exclusively to specific sexual taboos. But through a materialist sociological lens, the sin of Sodom is the ultimate social friction. It is the weaponization of violence and sexual assault against guests.
I think we need to explain the ancient Near East hospitality code here. Because to a modern listener, hospitality means putting fresh towels in the guest room.
Exactly. It's not about being a good host.
In this ancient context, it wasn't just about being polite, it was an international treaty for survival.
Absolutely. In a brutal desert environment, the hospitality code was the most sacred, essential survival network that existed. If you were traveling between cities, you rely completely on the hospitality of strangers to not die of exposure, dehydration, or banditry.
So when they attack the guests,
When the mob of Sodom surrounds the house and attempts to break down the door to assault travelers, they are not just committing a localized crime. Society is cannibalizing its own survival mechanisms.
oh wow,
By weaponizing assault against the very network that keeps human beings alive in the desert, they are destroying the foundational trust required for any civilization to function.
they are burning down their own infrastructure.
Yeah.
They are guaranteeing that no one will ever trade with them or visit them again.
Yes, and that is what the gofrit and esh represent. The fire and brimstone are the mythological encodings of terminal societal burnout. When the productive forces, the tzedakah, and the moral order of a community completely disintegrate, the society self-immolates.
The mob is the fire.
The text uses the imagery of fire raining from the sky to document the physical reality of a society that has torn itself apart at the seams. It is the physics of a system reaching maximum entropy.
Okay, I want to jump in on the melach, the pillar of salt, because I think this is a brilliant psychological encoding of what happens during a collapse. If fire and brimstone are the active destruction of the city, salt is the aftermath.
The aftermath, yes.
Think about it materially. Salt sterilizes agricultural land. If you salt the earth, nothing can grow there anymore. It's the absolute end of production. So think about Lot's wife looking back at the burning city. Let me use an analogy. Looking back at Sodom is like a modern investor psychologically clinging to a completely bankrupt industry, or holding on to a plummeting toxic stock because they simply cannot admit the value is gone.
That's a profound way to look at it. She is tethered to a dead system.
The paralysis is the punishment. By refusing to detach from a failed self-cannibalizing structure, She becomes a monument to that failure. She becomes melic, sterile, and immobile. She is trapped in the past.
Yeah.
But I have to ask you, if Lot's wife represents the inability to detach from a failed structure, how does this violent destruction, the fire, the mob, the salt, serve the overarching trajectory of the biblical narrative? Where does this specific wire go?
We answer that by tying the final dialectical wire of our deep dive today. Sodom represents the terminal end state of human hostility and mob violence. It is the algorithm of retributive, cannibalistic violence running to its logical conclusion, which is total destruction. Now look at the New Testament. Christ faces this exact identical mechanism. Yes, an angry, irrational mob demanding his body. We see it in the Garden of Gethsemane when they come with swords and clubs, and we see it at his trial before Pilate when the crowd demands his execution.
Right.
The society surrounds him, demanding violence, just like the men of Sodom surrounded Lot's door. But here is the massive shift. Instead of blinding the mob, as the messengers did in Genesis 19, and instead of raining Gofret and Esh down on Jerusalem for its corruption, Christ short-circuits the Sodom algorithm.
Okay, let's unpack this. How does he short-circuit it?
Yeah.
Because if religion is applied physics, he has to do something to the momentum of that mob.
He surrenders his body to the mob. In Sodom, the threat of bodily violence triggers apocalyptic destruction from the heavens. The violence is reflected back tenfold. In the Gospels, Christ absorbs the violence.
This makes it.
He absorbs the destruction rather than reflecting it back onto the city. He transforms the fire and brimstone of divine retributive consequence into the quiet execution of the cross. By letting the mob do its worst to him and responding with forgiveness, he forever neutralizes the cycle of retributive violence. He breaks the physics of societal collapse by refusing to participate in the retaliation.
He takes the Gofret and Esh and extinguishes them in his own blood. The exact blood that he offered is the new Barrett we talked about in chapter 17. The trajectory is just, it's breathtaking when you zoom out and see the architecture of it.
It is entirely cohesive. The material infrastructure built in Genesis is exactly the structure confronted, absorbed, and transformed in the Gospels.
So let's summarize the massive terrain we have covered today. If you've been tracking with us, you know we have definitely not been reading Sunday school morality tales.
Far from it.
We have looked at the raw, brutal scaffolding of human survival. We unpacked the reproduction economics of an agrarian patriarchy in Genesis 16 and saw how the divine Roy, the site, granted personhood to the discarded invisible underclass.
We analyzed the tribal boundary markers in Genesis 17, exposing the Benit and circumcision as an ironclad material ledger designed to prevent defection, which was later inverted by Christ into a mechanism of voluntary inclusion.
Right, and we stress-tested the calculus of civic justice with Abraham in Genesis 18, watching him calculate the threshold of Saddukim needed to keep a corrupt structure from collapsing, a threshold Christ eventually dropped to zero.
Yes.
And finally, we witnessed the terminal physics of societal collapse in Genesis 19, where the weaponization of violence against the survival network of hospitality resulted in the Gofret, Esh, and Melech, the fire, brimstone, and salt of total systemic burnout.
Just total burnout.
We have seen step by step how the ancient text built the material infrastructure that the New Testament eventually unwinds.
It is a profound trajectory. But before we close, we must leave you, the listener, with a final, unresolved thread to mull over. Something that builds on this material, but complicates it even further.
Give it to us. What is the lingering question?
At the very end of Genesis 19, after the fire and the salt, Lot and his 2 daughters are hiding in a cave. The daughters, believing that the entire world has been destroyed and that there are no men left on earth, resort to getting their father drunk and committing incest with him.
Yikes.
Their explicitly stated goal is to preserve their father's bloodline. This act produces the ancestors of the Moabites and Ammonites.
Wow. Okay. That is a dark, desperate place to end the narrative.
But look at it through the lens of applied physics. Here is the thought I want you to take with you. If the overarching material drive of these Genesis narratives is survival at any cost, securing the bloodline, maintaining the boundary, ensuring the future no matter what, at what point does the desperate architecture of survival become the very thing that degrades our humanity? When does the biological imperative override the moral structure so completely that the cure becomes the disease?
When did the cure become the disease?
Yeah.
That is haunting. Put yourself in that cave. You think the world has ended, and the only rule left is survival. It brings us right back to where we started today, doesn't it?
It really does.
We want these ancient texts to give us clean binary lines, good guys and bad guys. But instead, we find ourselves in the diagnostic, muddy waters of human desperation, looking at a survival algorithm that is as terrifying as it is brilliant. Thank you for taking this deep dive with us today. Keep questioning the text, keep looking for the physical realities beneath the spiritual words, and never settle for a flat reading of a three-dimensional history. We will see you next time.